had a fairly good run of it in terms of the focus on the witness statements, re-examining the commitment to republicanism in the Rising by Fergal, one of his themes. We have looked at unionist reaction. We have heard the unionist diary of the Rising, which is a rare document. And we had Margaret really looking at how the whole thing was played out 50 years later. And that debate, did the commemoration of the 1916 Rising contribute to the Troubles 2 or 3 years after that? So there was plenty of food for thought there. Could we have the first question, please?
Thank you. Did the Easter Rising change the course of events, or did it just speed up the course of events? Because by 1916, before the Rising, it was inevitable there was going to be a Home Rule Parliament in Ireland. The issue was whether it was going to be 23 counties, 26 counties or 28 counties. And once there was a Home Rule Parliament established, like, it was probably inevitable that those in it, as what we're seeing in Scotland, would have demanded more powers, would eventually have been granted Dominion status and probably independence sometime in the future. So really was a consequence of the Rising to speed those events all up and inject a lot of violence into the process as well.
Fergal, would you like to take that on board?
I suppose my answer would be, one, we don't really know. We can only guess. But your analysis, it seems to me, is a perfectly reasonable one. I think the partition was going to happen anyway, and some form of devolved rule was going to happen anyway. So violence sped things up, and that raises the question of, was it worthwhile? And maybe some of the sort of the classical revisionist historians would say, well, this sort of suggests that maybe there was something fundamentally unnecessary and immoral about the Republican violence. But I think that it's not. The question isn't really that clear cut. I think violence was very effective in persuading the British government to give a much greater degree of independence that they would have given otherwise. I mean, if you compare, for example, what was on offer in 1920 to Ireland, it was basically a Home Rule settlement, a settlement which Northern Ireland kind of took, to the settlement which was on offer in 1921, which was largely a result of effective Republican violence. It's a much more, I wouldn't say fundamental, but it's a radically more generous degree of independence, which moves from Home Rule to Dominion rule, and Dominion rule really leaves open that process of peaceful evolution to a republic. I suppose the question is, could a Home Rule Parliament, if it had been, granted peacefully, have led to that same kind of type of settlement? Maybe it could, but maybe it would have changed the course of history. I don't think we know personally, but some of the other historians might have an answer.
But it might have had a separate founding narrative, I suppose. Another question, I suppose, could be, we tend to look at 16 as part of a continuum going through to 1921 or 1922. But as Fergal said earlier, had conscription not been introduced when it was, is it necessarily the case of what we call the revolution of the more immediate period of 1919 to 1921? Might that, there's no inevitability about that, I suppose. Is there an inevitability in 1916 itself for the whole long period? I'm not sure that there is, though we often read it as if there is.
I think the other point worth making is that, as Churchill said about the executions, remember, nobody was executed during the Fenian Rising of 1867. People like Tom Clark, for his Fenian activities just after that, were given long terms of imprisonment. But as Churchill wrote, grass grows quickly over a battlefield, but never over a scaffold. It was really the executions, I think, that added that momentum that you're talking about towards independence.